August 29th, 2022 meeting of a special meeting of the Village of Lake Bluff Board of Trustees and Joint Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeal. Clerk, please call the roll.
Trustee Ankman?
Here.
Trustee Brianna?
Here.
Trustee Marquis?
Here.
Trustee Rapper?
Here.
And President Charlo?
Thank you. First on our agenda is our non-agenda items and visitors. The Joint Plan Commission of, actually the Village Board, allocates 15 minutes during this item for those individuals who would like the opportunity to address the board on any matters not listed on the agenda. Each person addressing the Village Board of Trustees is asked to limit their comments to a maximum of 3 minutes.
President Charlotte, the one thing we need to do is to do the roll for the PCCDA as well.
Good evening. Member Danley.
Here.
Member Fisher.
Here.
Member Miller.
Here.
Member Russell.
Here.
Member Sorensen.
Here.
Member Toll.
Here.
Chair Peters.
Here.
You have a quorum.
And Mr. President, there was no one virtually raising their hand to have comments for that item you read too as well.
Thank you very much, and I do not see anybody in this room willing to make a comment. So I say we are proceeding to item number 3.
Yep.
That would be the consideration of July 20th, 2022, a Village Board and PCCBA joint workshop minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Thank you. Second.
Second.
Thank you. Any changes to these minutes?
Voice vote.
Thank you, Clerk. This is a voice vote. Anyone in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? So the motion passes. Thank you.
And now the PCCB needs to do the same.
Next item is item number 4, or workshop number 5 as a joint Village Board workshop for planned residential development regulations. Mr. Blue, would you mind taking over?
Thank you, Mr. President, Board of Trustees, members of the Plan Commission, good evening. It's good to see you again. We didn't really anticipate or have a specific presentation tonight. Staff did an outstanding job of the packet that you have includes the current draft. It includes a red line that shows the changes that you directed at the last meeting. There are some data tables that show some of the information that came up last time that you all were very interested in seeing. So it was not our intent to take your time with the presentation and all that. The work, again, that staff has taken the lead on has reflected the discussion last time. There were still some questions that were being discussed or that we ended with last time, and to the extent that you have more specific questions, we wanted you to have another chance to talk about that so that we didn't just kind of stop and go, okay, we're done. So with that, I actually would ask Drew and Glenn and Ben, if there's other specifics you wanted to add to that or things you wanted to highlight for the board and Plan Commission.
It's all right, President Charlo, I just wanted to point out, one of the things that was a topic of debate amongst the most recent and previous workshops was the idea of who can start down this pathway, but by what properties, and there's a lot of good conversation at the last meeting. We decided the cleanest way to do it is spell it out on a visual aid with a map and say, okay, these properties are eligible to go through that. I hope you all like that. We thought that was a clean way to approach it, and that was a big part of the conversations. We also made numerous changes to the draft to reflect the comments that we've heard so far. We think it's reflective of the conversations and the direction it's provided. And frankly, if there's not a lot of comment, and if you want to get into wordsmithing, if it's not high level, then we can do that. If people are still concerned with maybe some of the substantive issues dealing with the densities, the effective transitions, and I'm going back to the list in the memorandum, of our high-level goals, what we're trying to achieve, preservation of either natural areas or historic sites, coordination with the other development tools, and something, I had a brief conversation with Member Russell from the PCCBA earlier today, and we were joking about how we need to blow the dust off the subdivision ordinance, and he corrected me and said we need to get an excavator out and uncover it. It's actually more dusty than that, and so that's probably something that we should take off the back burner and start looking at as well. And then the last high-level goal was to kind of rewriting this and really reflect of what you want, what you want to see. And that was a big part where we spent a lot of time at the very beginning of this, looking at the purpose statement, looking at some of the high-level objectives and initiatives there. So again, we think this reflects the direction so far, and you all wanted to come together one last time to look at it all written down. I heard from a few of you with some comments, and I can bring those up, or you can, but
I mean, we can go two ways. We can go free form on this discussion, or we can go through the red line items and see if there are further discussions on these items, to be specific.
I had a number of questions. Some of them were of the nature of wordsmithing, perhaps. So the one question that I had that I thought maybe addresses some of the larger topics, on page 7, 10-17-5, the quote is, "All developments in a PRD are subject to the zoning applicable in the underlying zoning district." And given that, even with the bonuses, I wondered, how much are we ever going to attain anything that's akin to housing that's affordable, or an affordability of housing, or however you want to talk about that? I know there are technical definitions of what is affordable housing, but also just more affordability. And it seems like with the underlying numbers and the bonus, that isn't something that's hugely changing.
and I think our conversation was no.
Yeah.
This did not effectuate that.
Yeah.
But that's, I think, something that was talked about a little bit when the conversations were being had around what, defining the public benefit, what that looked like. And so, but this does not incentivize that at all.
And is this
Yeah.
our best opportunity to do so, or are there other avenues for meaningful discussions and changes regarding that?
Drew, could I chime in just for a second? Because I just came across something the other day. I was looking through notes that I had made after a meeting. This may illuminate what you're talking about. Back in January of 2020, when Peter Kite, who owns the Stonebridge property, had a meeting at the Lake Bluff Library. I don't know if anybody was there, but it was a very interesting meeting that was had mostly with the residents of the West Terrace. And in the notes I came across, I remember asking him after the meeting, and I wrote this down because I think it's in a way related to what you're talking about. I asked him why the price point that he had planned was around $900,000, and if he could bring it down and get into the 400s or 500s at any part of that development. And basically the answer was no, because of the constraints of the density that at the time, that he was entitled to. Now that's changed, as you know. So I think that he basically said that the materials he would have to use and the houses he would build for that price point wouldn't be what people would expect to buy here. So it's the conundrum that we have, and I think we addressed it a little bit last time with the price of the land is so prohibitively expensive, and we've seen that a couple times with Block 3, that the applicants will stand up at the podium and say, look, the price of the property is X, and to get an ROI, I have to build something. So I don't know that we're gonna ever get past that.
So I have a question for you,
Wait,
because,
I'm sorry, is it all right? It's all right, right?
yeah, absolutely.
So just, I guess, going back to your first point, yes, this is another way to address it. Again, if the consensus of the group was to go back and look at the public benefits, I mean, D1 on page 10 lists age-restricted or age-target development for those looking to remain in or move to the village. So depending on affordability, I mean, I think that's that's one way to do it. There could be other ways, but also, and trustee Brianna, I was at that meeting too, and we talked,
Right.
I remember, I think the
The three of
underlying
us had that
land is
conversation.
going to dictate, economics are going to force things. And if the village wants to see that type of housing, well, I'll let Mike go.
Yeah, I was going to go back to the discussion last time too. You'll recall that Village Attorney Schuster and I kind of were doing backflips trying to explain affordable housing and housing that's affordable. It's complex, right? And what most community, and I'm thinking specifically the part of your question, which was, is this our last chance to look at this question? And I would say no, that communities that look at it, but look at it specifically as a housing plan or an affordable housing plan or just a housing plan. If it was going to be part of this, you might add a public benefit about affordability or something about affordability, but it's not something that you just kind of tuck in and go, hey, make this affordable. There's a little bit of an analysis there to understand, as trustee Brianna talks about, there's a whole land component, there's a lot to it. And this could be a way to do it with a future amendment based on that kind of analysis, but to just kind of slide it in here and make it part of it is a little bit of an oversimplification. Wasn't really where we started down the road when we all
Right.
did this.
Right.
So it's a little bit of a simplification, but I would suggest to you this is not the last and only chance to do it.
I do understand that it's highly complex. It's just, having been around for a while, my hair's gotten a lot grayer over the last few years, and I just want to see, well, if it hasn't gifted itself to us or presented itself to me, I thought I'd just ask the question, because I'm just getting older. And everybody is, so, it's really that simple. I don't have a specific agenda. I'm just wanting to, if this isn't it, then what is, and how can we move forward on that? And it's not here. It's not now.
I mean, the conversation is not about Stonebridge. We have a few other spots in town that could benefit from affordable housing and zoning. And so that conversation is very relevant, but it's deferring to Michael on this subject.
And again, I would just say again, it's a separate question. It's a related but separate question that merits a separate assessment. The other thing that is possible that a lot of communities do, and you talk about getting older, and I'm going to assume that, and I have way more gray hair than anybody here, and I would assume that we're talking perhaps about senior-oriented or age-restricted senior living. Some communities will get involved in a project to try and make that happen, right? So there's, a very direct effort to go out, find a developer, work with the property, and do those sorts of things. So these are not the only chances to do it. You don't have to go back and, redo the whole code to be involved. There's other ways to do it.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a question on that? Because wasn't there a senior commission with Lake Forest and Lake Bluff where they were talking about doing Grove School, the old Grove School complex and stuff? Is that something where we participate as, I don't remember how that worked exactly. You
It's still in the
remember?
works.
And then COVID.
Yeah, it's still, and it's actually changed location. It's up now by the existing, I guess the idea or concept is now, it's in Lake Forest, it's on a site off Telegraph, that kind of kitty corner from the fire station, the site that there's some existing cottages that are built there. They're looking at adding units there. And the village has been part of those conversations to participate financially in that project, to open the door to that and potentially all the other affordable housing units in the community, given that the village's current affordable housing plan talks about, I think to your point, trustee Inkerman, how difficult it is to do it in a small community. We just don't have that many opportunities, right? And that's what that the village's policy states out immediately. It's like, look, this is not going to be easy because we don't have an abundance of property that hasn't been developed that makes us, there's not a lot of opportunities. We have a very small canvas. So that was one of the reasons why the village board had considered, and it still is considering, the idea of participating in another site that's not necessarily in the village, but it's contiguous and then with a community that we partner with on providing senior services already. So that's been something that's been talked about. That is another opportunity for something like that to happen, for sure.
Thank you.
I'll just offer a little bit of perspective. I don't want, on affordable housing, I don't want to revisit. It sounds like you guys had a lengthy discussion about defining affordable housing, which is a bit of a misnomer because affordable housing would be at 60% or 80% of area mean income. And I don't think there's anybody that is, there are many people that would qualify that are currently living here and are aging and would fit in the 60 or 80% area mean income. So we're probably talking about middle income housing. The way that a lot of communities do it, or at least the city of Chicago, is when a developer comes in and they're building, they have to build 20% affordable. In that case, it's real affordable. It's 60% area mean income, or a weighted average of 60, meaning you could have 80 or 40 as long as it balances out to 60. That's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about moderately priced homes for maybe 100 to 150% area mean income. And I would just suggest if that was important to us, I think it would be a disadvantage in terms of really getting developers here, because it would make, if they had to build 20% of their homes at a $400,000 or $450,000 price point, it would disincentivize development. So it is a really, really tough challenge, but I think that would be the mechanism in a PRD, is to require some sort of a percentage to be of 20% at some area mean income. Just thought I'd offer that up.
And again, like you said, not to revisit, but we had kind of drawn the distinction last time between affordable housing, which is, as you say, a very specific term, and the idea of housing that's more affordable.
Yes.
Right, so not something that's a set aside or a 20%, because as you say, to have it be a set aside or a 20%, like in Chicago, is not, is not something that we felt was likely.
Thank you for engaging in the discussion. It's something that I think is important. I don't know the answer. I just know that it's an unanswered question.
Well, so it's true that we're not just talking about Stonebridge, but just for, since it's featured in the packet, the Zenny property's 32 and a half acres. It's actually 2 parcels, and one of them is for sale for $13,900. So there's your impediment. If you're gonna, and then the other one I think is around 11 or 12, probably. It's hard to say. So at any rate, that's the impediment. That's a 12-acre lot, and it's $14 million. So if you spend $14 million for 12 acres, unless you are altruistic and you're doing this for reasons that don't have anything to do with ROI, you're not going to be able to meet that. That's the impediment. I really think we're in a particular zip code that has prohibitively expensive land prices. So I think you're right. It's a goal, but I don't know how we meet it unless, Michael, I was going to ask you, and maybe Trustee Rappin, you just brought this up. Where do communities come in behind the developer to subsidize something to make that possible? Not subsidized housing, but to back them up so that we can get the price down. I mean, does that happen?
Land, real estate, tax abatements,
So more like a
utilities.
TIF.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about the lower income strata, like if we were interested in 60 to 80% area mean income,
Right.
there are federal programs that help provide the subsidy to make it work. But for a community to come up with that kind of gap money, I think it's a big ask.
I think I probably talked about this last time we had the discussion, but in my experience in Highland Park was that the city identified a series of fees that it might waive. So there would not be building permit fees, for instance, for an affordable unit, or there wouldn't be impact fees for an affordable unit. So there's opportunities to waive fees that aren't specific subsidies, like writing down the price of land or that sort of thing.
Right.
It might be great to offer that as an option of, we will waive this, we will waive that, if you will build units at, a lower price point somehow. Not that they have to choose that, but that it's an option if they choose.
Would you think that would be applicable to age restricted as well? Because I think there's a huge market for maintenance-free, age-restricted living too.
I don't see why it couldn't apply to that. You just would have to make the economics, the savings to the developer enough to offset, their financial model. You'd have to save them quite a bit of money.
Maybe.
Just one more thought, along that line, probably the only area I would think would be the property, the village property east of Jawa. You know, that's 11.9 acres. Oh, sorry. The property east of Jawa, 11.9 acres owned by the village. Village could be a participant, you know, something like that, possibly, if that was a desire that everybody agreed on.
Yeah.
It is a concern of ours. It is actually a primary concern of ours for that type of property, yes.
Just a couple other thoughts on the affordable housing, one of which I think is, and I've done a lot of projects, in the North Shore in this area that deal with affordable housing in some capacity, is the expectation of whether or not you're gonna have a couple of units, 1 or 2 or 3 units that are affordable, or a affordable development in which you're gonna get 40 units that are affordable, is a very different proposition. So for example, Deerfield has a development going on right now where I think it's 44 units or 42 units. It's a large number, but it was a church that donated a huge site because the church was closing up and said, we want to turn our land into this type of project. But that's very different than what we see in a lot of our communities that we represent, in which they have a 50 unit or 100 unit condo buildings or apartment buildings, and they're dedicating as part of the development as a public benefit, putting forth 2 of those units or 4 of those units as affordable. And a lot of that goes into negotiation in terms of the density. So for example, we had a building just recently, and it was a planned development. They wanted flexibility. They wanted, that was not proposed initially with affordable housing, but the village agreed to give them an extra floor where I don't know how many units were on the floor, but let's say 8 units, but then they could dedicate, as part of that, they would agree to dedicating 4 of those units to affordable. So part of it's a numbers game of what your expectation is, and then, and the bigger the development, it's easier economically to be able to find either the incentives through the zoning relief or benefits through some waiving of fees that allow them to have a few of those many, many units. And I think the biggest problem in terms of incentivizing for Lake Bluff is going to be if somebody's coming through with a development of 4 homes, saying one of them has to be affordable, it just economically doesn't work. And you really need to focus, it's a question of how many larger developments, because that's where the math starts to be more feasible.
Right, and
So-
I get that, but that's kind of why I'm asking the question now, because this is addressing things that are 6 acres or larger.
So the question I have for you, Ben, and I understand that the document we're talking about is meant to be flexible. Is that something we need to codify ahead of time, or should we leave that as part of negotiation, as you said?
Well, so one of the things, the potential public benefit, in that section states, public benefits that may be proposed include, and it lists some, and it's a may, and you could, if you wanted, leave it and let somebody, and then you can see if they want to offer that as a public, or if it's really important, and you could put a section in there that under one of them, we have age-restricted development, historic preservation, you could put in there affordable housing. Now, they may or may not be able to meet that. I mean, they're not required to meet that requirement. They could propose public art or something else, but that could be a way to signal to the development world, if you're gonna come in here, this should be something at least you think about as one of the many options.
And I do think that's important that we talked about how some of the elements of this document, when I got a little too granular earlier, that this was aspirational, if you will, right? It doesn't mean that everybody has to have all of these things. It's kind of aspirational. And it's a signal, it's a read between the lines, or actually read the lines.
Let's be more specific. Can I get a temperature on the boards for if you guys would support such wording into the document?
Absolutely. I think it's a good policy move forward. We don't have anything to lose by doing that, and I think we have everything to gain. I don't know if we can say affordable housing, because that has a specific meaning, as well as, because we maybe are being too narrow with that term, because Steve and Michael have both said that has a very specific meaning to developers. And then there's another way to say it, which is housing that's affordable. How do we,
Middle income.
middle income? And then that defined here as X, you know, including but not limited to, our favorite phrase. So I think maybe both, because we don't want to leave that out. I don't know, Michael, what do you think about that, making it more
Let's-
complete?
Let's move to, before we ask Michael, Joy, what do you think?
I think I would be open to that depending on how it was worded, and what we were trying to do with it. I guess my question to Michael on that is, would we want it very open-ended or very specific? So, I mean, I think depending on how it was worded, I think I would
Thank
be
you.
open to that.
You know, in terms of process, just really quickly, I mean, this is a workshop. The idea this is going to go through the PCZBA for other workshops. And so, I mean, if these ideas can continue to flow, I mean, we can have more workshops, or we can send it to the PCZBA and they can work through these elements and come back with a recommendation for words just like this, right?
I would fully support it's totally an option to the developer, and it's something that is, you know, will be looked upon favorably. And if we could articulate it as middle income housing, you know, targeting, you know, this document's got to live for a while, but between $400,000 and $600,000 units or homes, or the PCZBA can work on that. But I would be in favor of that, absolutely.
Thank you.
I guess my question is that not, that middle income, is that in perpetuity, and are we expected to follow up so that maybe the initial purchase is middle income, but then what about subsequent? Are we going to require them to verify every time it changes hands that it continues to be middle income?
I assume that'd be handled through a development agreement and things like
Yeah,
that.
so typically, if that was important to you, you could have a restrictive covenant recorded that would require them to meet requirements, whether it's in perpetuity. I've also seen it for a certain number of years, for 20 years or 30 years, and then whatever income levels, there would be a prove-up, so to speak, with the village saying they're meeting the covenant's requirements. But that's entirely up to the village in terms of how that gets structured in the negotiation with the developer. But that's easy to do if you'd like it to be done that way.
I guess my question is more specific, and what is the temperature on that as far as keeping it middle income and keeping track of it?
The covenant runs with the land, right, Ben? Yeah, so it's recorded against that property, so it would be something that the buyer would be aware of at the time. So I'd be in support of that in the same way I support age-restricted housing, because I think it serves a need, and it's really something we wouldn't have, staff would never have to worry about it because it would be recorded against the house.
Yeah, I mean, it could get a little bit tricky, and Ben, you know better than me, if it's a percentage of income, like 150% of area median income, there has to be some compliance done on an annual basis, so that's a burden. So I think we'd have to explore that, but I would certainly be in favor of how are we define that affordability element to do it in a way that is least burdensome, but continues for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly standard process and how, you know, and how it's structured, and these are within the industry, fairly, and from a compliance standpoint, it's not that difficult, particularly if it's rental. If it's done in a rental manner, it's just every 2 years or every, you know, you do a prove up and they meet, you know, and they would show us documentation. If it's a large number of units, some municipalities will hire an agency to help them do all the administrative work. It just depends how you're gonna operate it. But, you know, I think that that would be a large part, I would think, even if you put something in here, it would be a sentence or two, but we can get into all the nuance on a project-by-project basis because it will differ from project to project. And that will be part of the development agreement negotiation and that whole process. So we don't have to get that far in the weeds for the purposes of this ordinance. And I don't suggest it because you want to be nimble enough to achieve that goal depending on the type of development and how it may come before you.
One more item,
I
Michael.
was just going to say, a couple of you asked, so I would simply say what Ben said. I would deal with it on a case-by-case basis. I don't know that I would put a number in it or try and be that specific, because you do want it to be evergreen. It ultimately becomes part of your negotiation with the developer, as Ben says, it's part of a development agreement. But the idea of putting it in there is a really interesting one, that they can come to you and say, what do you mean about this? And then, the staff would say, what are you thinking of? And it would be a case-by-case discussion. And as we've been talking about here, every development here is so unique, right, that you want to leave yourself the flexibility to have whatever affordability discussions they are, be just as flexible, just as unique to that development.
Thank you, that actually answered my question that I asked earlier.
I was paying attention.
Do we, I have a few things in mind, but before I get, are we seeing any issues in these documents that are stopping on our tracks this document to be further considered? Anything that seems, is it responding to the past few conversations, or are we still having issues, general issues with that document for things that we're not comfortable with? Jill? Oh,
I don't have any
George.
major concerns, but I just have a few more detailed questions. Number one, under common open space, Michael, would we consider stormwater ponds to be common open space? It doesn't seem to be addressed in the list on page 10, number 4 down near the bottom.
Oh, I did with that. I was actually, find my bag. I was going to go look
This
to,
is the red line version,
oh, I don't have the printout. I was going to go to the definition, actually, which is,
August 12th.
I apologize. Ben, do you have the definition in front of you? Because we talked about this last time.
Okay, if it's okay, you do have
Yeah,
a,
looking, give me 1 second.
Page
okay, it does say a combination of land and water, so I guess that would seem to say that the stormwater ponds would be considered common open space.
That was generally the intent, is that it's something that doesn't belong to somebody individually, that adds to the open space feel. I think we said last time that the open space requirement was as much an aesthetic issue as anything else. So certainly the a stormwater area would add to that benefit.
And then it leads to my concern that the prevalence and requirements for stormwater detention facilities these days, quite a bit of the 15% minimum that we're requiring could be eaten up just with stormwater ponds. And I think Stonebridge, as it was approved, probably sits between the stormwater ponds and the open space at somewhere around 35% open space. And I'm wondering if that 15% number is on the extreme low side for the larger parcels, and that maybe there should be some sort of sliding scale. I don't know what specifically to suggest, but that's a concern, that 15% number is awfully low, considering once you carve out stormwater ponds surface areas from there, it's not going to require much in the way of green space.
I think that's a great point. I would only suggest that the way it's drafted and the intent that it's drafted is that if it's going to carve out 30% instead of the 15, it's really met the intent and then some of the 15%.
Okay, well, I don't want us to be in the weak position with the developer. I'd rather be in the strong negotiation position. Then also, the very next section, the paragraph on anti-monotony, I'm struggling with why the last sentence is really there. You lay out, this is on page 11 at the top, you lay out that you don't want monotony in
George,
single-family homes.
before you continue, so you say 15% would not be enough. What is the percentage for Tangley Oaks? What do we have there?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head. Don't know.
Because we have 4 lakes, I think, there. And that would be, that might be a nice compromise to consider that number as well.
Well, I was actually
Be
thinking.
good to look at before it works through the process. Yeah.
I was actually thinking maybe we do a range there, and then depending on the piece of land, that's again something we could negotiate with the developer. If we say 15 to 30%, and then depending on the piece of land and how it's situated and what we feel like would, we might be able to negotiate it a little bit. It's just a thought.
15's the floor, right? at least.
And also, it's common open space, not just open space. So depending on, I don't know how the lots would be laid out, but if it's somebody's backyard and patio area and all, that's not counted. It's just the common.
Absolutely, common open space.
And it includes things such as entertainment or church as part of that 15%. So it's not going to be
No,
a pound of water.
None of the structures, none of the recreational. facilities.
Structures, right-of-way,
This is-
basketball courts, it's not that kind of open space, it's a green area.
Green,
Okay, I'm sorry.
And it's intended to create more than just a lot of asphalt in a development. And I agree that in a development that's 30% gonna have to deal with stormwater management, that makes the 15% low. I believe I said last time that, in discussing this internally, the 15% was based on my experience in Highland Park, trying to manage 20%. And a lot of development having trouble reaching 20% if it was kind of a standard property, not something that's unique and has a lot of stormwater issues. And again, like I said, if 30% is stormwater, then it's met the intent. There's gonna be that open feel to it. So it's not open space intended to be a park or a ball field or that sort of thing. It's just so that it's not all squeezed together is the technical term, right? And so it's a character item.
Thank you. George? You were going to a second point and I
yeah,
stopped
the
you.
next question was on top of page 11, anti-monotony. The very last, we spell out this is for, we don't want single-family dwellings to be too similar. But then we have the last sentence that says, this requirement is not applicable to developments specifically designed to establish a unified design format. Not quite sure what the
Well,
unified
so-
design, so I'm thinking of are you familiar with our sanctuary subdivision? So I don't want a developer coming in here and saying, well, I don't think most people would like more sanctuary type developments. Maybe the density will work, but you don't want every one of the homes to look, sorry, Barb, pretty much the same.
Depends on how affordable you want it.
Where you can't find your home unless the number's on the house. So I'm wondering, really, what is the purpose of the last sentence? Because the developer would argue, I would think the sanctuary developer would argue, well, that is a unified design. So
Good point.
Seems like
There
you're saying
there are other developments in town that have kind of a unified character as well. Help me, it's on Green Bay and I haven't been there in a year now, I don't remember.
Warrenton.
Armor Woods.
Thank you, Arbor. Right, so those have, that's kind of what it was intended for, those have a similar character. So you could look at those and go, now, those are all the same. But there's a design review process that's part of this, which would be the spot where you would look at a development and say, you know what, we get it, that it's a unified development, but the aspects of the unified development are not what we see. There's, this doesn't, it's not a get out of jail free card for design that doesn't fit the characteristics that are desired and appropriate for the village.
I can see a unified design format being used for the Jawa property, the 11 acres there, because it's so small. And if it were, say, age restricted, like if not obviously on the scale of Lake Forest Place, but low rise cottages like at the Presbyterian Homes in Evanston, they all look the same. But the landscaping, I think Armor Woods is a great example of unified, but the landscaping makes them all look so different, where they have minor changes. One has a courtyard, one doesn't, that it isn't, it doesn't offend. It's not too Stepford,
And again, the design review process would include considering that element that maybe common design was mitigated by landscaping. But again, George, the point's a good one. It wouldn't apply to developments that say, here's our unified design. The village does get a shot at addressing the design through the design review process, but your point's a good one, and that's what that sentence is intended to do. If it does something we don't want it to do, it can come out.
Okay. And then the last question I just had was on the top of page 9, when we're setting our maximum density limits, the 21.78 figure number for multiple family residences on an R5 lot. So I just cranked that out for our Block 3 project, which we've seen twice. And essentially that parcel is 3/4 of an acre, the PNC Bank lot property. Block 3, do I have the right number? Anyway, that would allow for 16 units at 21.78. Just want to make sure everybody's, certainly don't want to go any higher. It's pretty dense. I'm not sure where that came from or how it was generated. It doesn't tie back into our existing PRD regs at all, so. Seem to be hearing generally that was an awfully dense development.
So the basis of that figure, member Russell, derives from the existing R5 regulations. So if you're developing multifamily in R5, you need to have at least 1,000 square feet of land per one dwelling unit, no matter where you fit for FAR or things like that. That's been on the books probably 40 to 50 years. And so if you do 1 acre, or maybe it's even 2,000 square feet, but if you do that calculation, that's what gets you to the 21.78, and it's specifically for non-single family development for that reason.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Extrapolation of existing code.
Thank you. Thank you, George. Are there any more issues and concerns about this document?
Hi, can I just ask, one change seemed to be that we were going to, prior to applying, it has to all be owned by one party. And originally it was in the course of development, it became owned by one party, but since we're doing the preliminary development, is it still, was there a thought process behind why it needs to be that? I mean, I could see 3 property owners in, you know, the E1 district getting together and thinking they could get 4 properties or something, but before committing to that and buying each other's properties or something, do they need to be one owner just to apply? I guess that's my question.
Well, what we would look to see is that it's under common ownership or control, that we have typically one applicant. Now, they may set up a corporate structure to allow for that, to have 4 investors. Right. But we don't want to be dealing with 4 separate applicants. And most importantly, by the time they get their approval, we want one entity. Or whether it's control, and they can have different interests in it. But I think there's nothing that prevents somebody from creating that structure for preliminary. What we don't want is just 4 random people to show up and be like, we've been talking, over some beer about this great development, here I am. Because we want to make sure that they're serious, we want to make sure that they have an interest, and we want to know who we're dealing with. And that's really the idea. And then the common ownership and control is essential, because what we don't want is is a situation where we have no way of controlling a development. By having it all unified, we then can say, you're going to do a homeowners association before you start selling off the property, so we have controls to make sure this functions as the development that is being presented to you.
Right. I definitely understand that for the final, as you get further into it. I just was wondering, because the preliminary, you're still spending a pretty good amount of money to get you to the preliminary approval.
Well, and control might be a contract, a prospective contract to purchase.
Okay.
But it's, anybody can
It
come.
could be under,
Right,
okay.
but there's some type of document that they have a right.
it. Okay,
So
I'm
that
fine with
way, again, it's not just people who put on the back of a napkin, here I am. But, yeah, so there's a process in that control. And we see that with zoning contingencies all the time. It is no different, really, than somebody who comes in for a special use or a variation. They're gonna have to have that to even apply.
If there was a change from.
It's what we do today.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Regis, one of the other, to your point, one of the other things I was wondering about is the tension between number 4 and number 5, the common open space and the preserving environmental areas. That the preserved environmental areas may be counted towards the required common open space, and yet, like a savanna, a tree stand, wetlands,
Page
10, page 10 of the revised,
clean
the
one.
update. And I guess what I'm asking is, do we feel like there's any support for that being something that would be separate from the common space, or is that just too much to ask? Or is there some perhaps contingency depending on the size of the piece of property? Because if there's tree stands, ponds, streams, et cetera, I know we just talked about this, but common space to me implies something that can be used. I think trustee Marquise brought this up before, you know, where it's accessible and open to people. I understand it might be a homeowners association, but like it talks about bike paths and pedestrians, et cetera, so that implies connectivity and openness to others. Whereas an environmental area may be best left set aside. So does anybody feel like those might not work well together because they somewhat conflict? You know, when you have a sensitive environmental area, you don't necessarily want people using it as common space.
Boy, that's a great point. I think it may well be as simple as the fact that common open space is the wrong term that I put in here. I think you're right. I think common open space implies that it's the field we all get to go play ball in.
Right.
Right? And maybe it's just, maybe there needs to be a better term to describe it. Because again, as I mentioned with the idea of stormwater management, to the extent that it's just open area, it creates a more airy feel to a development. It's an aesthetic issue. And I now that you mention it, I think maybe calling something other than common open space helps clarify that, so that it's clear, or maybe it's in the definition, I don't know, that it's not, you know, the shared ball field that everybody's going to, that would hint that somebody should, you know, put a backstop in the middle of a savanna, which you
Right.
certainly wouldn't want. So
Like
I think that's as much nomenclature
There
as
is a good
anything else.
example in town for that type of behavior and that people have been trying to imitate. And I could think about a few people on the south side of Lake Bluff. Basically, that was Tangley Oaks with 25 feet of preserved area. That would be vegetation you cannot touch. And that has moved over the last 25 years to buckthorn, and buckthorn couldn't be removed until the last 2 years. But it basically preserved the character of that development. And this is, I think, what you're talking about. And it could be savanna, or it could be a wooded area, it could be buckthorn,
Ravine,
it's
it could-
green.
yeah.
Conservation area.
Conservation area is exactly what I'm saying, so that it's a set aside. So if you look at Fort Sheridan, you have the old parade grounds right there that would easily be referred to as open space. But then you have ravines that are so sensitive, and obviously there's the Lake County has come in and purchased a lot of it. But I just think that would be a good way to describe that, so that we're differentiating. Because, you know, that we always talk about Tree City USA, things like that. Maybe put a little bit more teeth into that part.
I think this is a good idea. Thank you.
Have we answered this question before? We might have in one of the previous meetings, but is transitional space, like if you had like berms or some kind of transition space into a existing neighborhood, is that also considered, is that a part of the 15% of the open space, the common open space?
Yes, if it's not part of something that's privately owned, if it's not part of somebody's property, like if I'm trying to think of an example, if the berm is at the back of a commonly owned, probably yes. I'm trying to think of the example where it might not, but
Okay.
I'm going with probably yes.
Okay.
I can't off the top of my head think of where it wouldn't.
And then this is just a general question. Would any new development that we put in have a homeowners association? Are they all guided by
Probably.
a homeowners association at this point?
Probably, yes.
Okay. I guess I was just curious, because it's, I don't know, I feel like you get a little more diversity in a neighborhood and a little more character in a neighborhood when you don't have a homeowners association. I'm sure some people would argue that point, but, and again, when we talk about utilizing space in the village, I feel like the neighborhoods that aren't governed by a homeowners association, there seems to be more free open space for kids to move around, or residents in general to move around in those neighborhoods. That's kind of where the basis of that question was coming from.
This is set up to have HOAs. If you're gonna create common open space and mandate that it has to be at least 15%, somebody's gonna need to take care of it. So I think just the way this has been structured, you know, you're going to have a HOA of some form or fashion, at least a minimal one, to govern that common open space. The other way to do it would be if you wanted to change this slightly to have dedications, and the village being willing to take on, you know, must have open space that is dedicated to the village, but then it becomes our responsibility to maintain that. But otherwise, it gets very difficult in most situations not to have some form or fashion.
There was mention about Fort Sheridan, a lot of the open space there is controlled by open lands. So you could have a third party
Right.
be the person that's ultimately responsible. As long as, all we want is that somebody else is responsible for
Right.
it.
And I guess that goes back to, you know, one of the questions that I've asked over and over again, which is, if the space in that neighborhood is governed by an HOA, then is it really open, is it really space to be utilized by any Lake Bluff resident? Because that doesn't always seem to happen, right? If there's an HOA, so essentially, if we put together a development and we put an HOA over it, which I know we don't want to have to manage everything, correct? But it almost feels like then we're excluding residents from using any of that property. And I don't know how other people feel about that, but I kind of like in Lake Bluff that there seems to be a lot of connectivity and people can move from space to space using open space within different neighborhoods, especially with children. So it's a point I'm probably going to continue to bring up because I feel kind of strong.
I was gonna say, I never like to pretend to be the lawyer in the room, especially when there's one here. But there's gonna be a development agreement, there's gonna be an ordinance, there's gonna be a process, there's gonna be a set of approvals that the village grants. The HOA can't ignore that just because it's commonly owned or they hold it, right? So if the development agreement or the plans that are part of the development approval show it as, you know, permanently open or part of a setback or something like that, the HOA doesn't have the authority to undo that.
Okay.
How'd I do?
Yeah, no, that's
Okay.
right, and I think it would be project by project.
Yeah.
You would look at and say, and if there's certain parts, let's say they create an amazing common lawn that is meant to be enjoyed by all, it's part of the conditions, it's part of the zoning approvals, if you know, so that's part of public benefit. To preserve it, so it's for all village residents and not just the couple homeowners, you could put a condition in the zoning ordinance that says this must be accessible, you know,
Forever free and
you know,
clear.
for, you know, anybody from the village or any member of the public. So there are other types of common open spaces that may be only for those who are part of that development, and that may be appropriate. So again, I think it's a great thought, and as projects come forward, I would urge you to think about it as part of the zoning approvals for that particular project to figure out which parts are important to you to maintain that public space.
We have two examples in town that are having different patterns, that is Stanley Oaks and Armor Woods. And they have clear signs in front of the ponds talking about those limits, basically to non-owners of that HOA. It is 6:57, actually I was trying to be a little bit earlier on that. Do we still have burning questions for this document? So it might be time to wrap up. Michael?
I can only say these have been great discussions since the very first one we had in, I don't even remember how long ago it was, but the discussions have been tremendous. And I know there's not as much development happening here as there is in other communities. And the ordinance is long and there's some precision to it. We did, as the village president noted, try to reflect what you all talked about. And the depth of the discussion that you all contributed really helped make that pretty doable. So for me, I just wanted to say thank you all for being part of this. I'm looking forward to working with you to continue in the process. And I hope you feel good about it because it's been your feedback that's made it work. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. And I believe that we are done with this meeting. Could I please have a motion to adjourn?
Just for clarity's sake, though, for next steps,
Public hearing.
Chair Peters, you're ready to pick up the gauntlet as opposed to the microphone and start those hearings? I think we are. Great. So we'll make the tweaks based off what we heard tonight and put it in your court.
Thank you very much for doing that. This is of tremendous benefit to our community. So thank you.
I would like to make a motion to adjourn.
Thank you so much. A second. Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Do they need to adjourn, Joe?
Technically, yes.
Gary,
So a little bit of housekeeping, will take about 5 minutes to
do we have to adjourn?
do the stuff.
To a motion to adjourn your portion of the first meeting.
Thank you.
Hold on.
Thank you. Glad you can make it.